Imagine for a second that you're, I don't know, walking through the desert, right?
Okay, sure.
And you stumble across this highly advanced, incredibly detailed engineering manual for a nuclear reactor.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking complete schematics. You've got fluid dynamics, containment protocols, step-by-step instructions for harnessing atomic energy, just the works.
Right. The absolute blueprint for a massive power source.
Exactly. But because the language is ancient and, because the people who found it centuries ago didn't have the slightest understanding of physics or engineering, they just decided to read it to their kids as a bedtime story.
Well, it's almost tragic, really. They look at a diagram of a highly volatile reactor core, and because they literally don't know what it is, they just tell a story about a magic glowing rock that grants wishes.
Yes, a fairy tale about a magic rock, and suddenly all that incredible world-building science is completely lost. It just becomes a cartoon.
It is comforting, in a way, I suppose. I mean, human beings naturally gravitate toward the simple.
We really do.
We like to categorize complex systems into neat little mythological boxes because, honestly, it demands absolutely nothing of us intellectually. A magic rock requires no work, but a nuclear reactor, that requires discipline, study, and flawless execution.
Right, which brings us to exactly why we are doing this deep dive today, because when you actually strip away the mythology and apply rigorous textual analysis and geopolitical history, that bedtime story gets flipped completely on its head.
It absolutely does.
So today we are looking at a textual landscape that has been profoundly misunderstood for centuries. For you listening, we're going to decode a specific, highly debated sequence of text. We're looking at Surah Al-Anbiya, which is chapter 21, specifically verses 69 through 80.
And this is a massive shift in perspective.
It's huge. Our mission here is to take a text that has historically been read by millions as a book of ancient fairy tales, and we are going to uncover how the source material actually presents it as a masterclass in civilizational physics, systems engineering, and statecraft.
It really is the absolute definition of an intellectual paradigm shift. Because the traditional narrative, the Sunday school version that most people are familiar with, is just filled with these infantile, cartoonish placeholders.
Placeholders that entirely obscure the genius of the text.
Exactly. They rob it of any practical utility.
Let's lay out that traditional narrative first, just so you, the listener, understand exactly what we're dismantling today. If you read the popular interpretations of these verses, the imagery is just wild.
Oh, it's completely fantastical.
Right. You start with the story of Abraham, where God supposedly talks directly to a literal, physical, raging bonfire, casting some sort of magic spell to turn the glowing coals cold so Abraham doesn't burn to a crisp.
Right, suspending the laws of thermodynamics.
Yeah. And then the text abruptly shifts to King David, and the traditional myth says he is running some sort of musical circus. He's literally sitting in the mountains playing a harp while rocks hum along and a choir of birds sings with him.
Like a Disney movie.
Exactly like a Disney movie. And then it moves to King Solomon, who is depicted essentially as an ancient comic book superhero, just commanding magical gusts of wind with his mind.
Which, when you say it out loud, sounds completely absurd for a text that explicitly claims to offer practical, rational guidance for human civilization.
It really does.
These myths, they completely rob the text of its deep material realism. We have to be clear here. Imparting what the source material actually argues, these aren't just innocent bedtime stories.
They're damaging.
Yes. They are systemic placeholders that hide a highly advanced geopolitical blueprint.
So if we aren't talking about magic spells, singing mountains, and supernatural winds, what are we actually looking at?
We are looking at a comprehensive treatise on what we can call civilizational physics.
Civilizational physics. I love that term.
It fits perfectly because this text lays down a blueprint for how a rational ideological movement survives a brutal state crackdown. It details how that movement executes calculated strategic migrations to high-yield geographic zones. And it explains how, once they secure that geography, they master metallurgy, logistics, intelligence networks, and heavy industry to build a superpower. It is entirely about resource optimization and statecraft.
It's the nuclear engineering manual.
It's the manual. And to read it as a story about a magic glowing rock is to completely miss the point of human progression.
Let's jump right into the deep end here. Let's look at the language surrounding Abraham and this famous fire, because the linguistic analysis completely shatters the myth.
It really does.
Now, the traditional folklore surrounding this event is almost comedic when you look closely at it. You have stories claiming that the fire was so massive and burned so hot for 40 days that Satan himself had to come down and invent a catapult, like a massive trebuchet, just to launch Abraham into the middle of it.
Yes, and it gets even more granular and absurd than that. There are traditional anecdotes claiming that a little chameleon came out of the jungle and started blowing on the flames to make them hotter.
Wait, really? A chameleon?
Yes. And because of that, to this day, certain traditionalists claim chameleons are somehow, quote-unquote, evil and should be killed.
It's wild. It's the absolute tyranny of unproven assertions.
It is.
But wait, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second. Isn't it a bit dangerous to just decide a text is metaphorical when people have read it literally for centuries? Empires literally burned people at the stake. Couldn't this just be a historical execution attempt?
It's a fair question, and it's one we have to address objectively. But here is where the text itself rejects the literal interpretation.
Okay, how so?
Well, the rigorous analysis of this text points out a glaring, undeniable fact. The text itself never actually mentions Abraham being thrown into a physical fire.
Wait, seriously, the central pillar of the Sunday school story isn't even in there?
It is not there. The text states that his oppressors intended to do this, that they plotted against him, but it never once says they actually picked him up, put him in a catapult, and launched him into a bonfire. Yeah, this completely changes the framework from a magical rescue mission to a geopolitical survival strategy.
Okay, then we really need to decode the most famous phrase from that sequence. The verse says, Kuni bardan wa salama. Now, the traditional translation is a command to the fire, basically saying, be cool and safe.
Right.
If it wasn't an anti-physics magic spell freezing literal burning coals, what is the systemic mechanism here? How do the sources decode this?
To understand the mechanism, we have to look at the Arabic word nar, which is traditionally translated as fire. But in the sociopolitical context of classical Arabic, nar represents the heat of anger, jealousy, revenge, and specifically the persecutorial power of an empire or a state.
Okay, so it's similar to how we use language today, like when we say the political climate gets hot, or a politician's taking a lot of heat, or a whistleblower's under fire.
Precisely. It is the furnace of state persecution. When an empire decides you are a threat, they turn up the heat.
They use economic sanctions.
Economic sanctions, propaganda, secret police, social ostracization. So, when the state unleashed its full persecutorial heat on Abraham's rational movement, what do? Did they panic and pray for the laws of physics to be suspended?
No, they deployed alternative networks.
Yes. They utilized safe houses. They maintained deep psychological stability.
They built structural insulation.
That's exactly it. They insulated their operations so efficiently that they could function calmly and flawlessly under immense political pressure. That systemic, non-destructive state of being insulated against the heat of the empire, that is the true meaning of Bardan wa Salama.
That makes so much sense.
It is the ability of a movement to remain perfectly cool, calculated, and secure while the state tries to systemically burn them to the ground.
That is infinitely more useful to you and me today than a story about a magic campfire. Think about how this applies to modern strategy. If you are running a startup, leading a community organization, or analyzing global geopolitics, and your environment becomes hostile when the regulatory or competitive heat is turned up, you don't sit around hoping for a miracle.
No, you'd be crushed.
You build structural insulation. You create resilient supply chains, redundant communication networks, and psychological fortitude.
And the brilliant thing is, survival is only step one. Because surviving the furnace of persecution, according to the source material, must be immediately followed by strategic migration.
The concept of hijra.
Exactly.
Right.
But we really have to clarify what hijra actually is, because historically, it has been wildly misunderstood as a form of escapism. People frame it as refugees fleeing in terror, just running away into the desert.
Which implies weakness. It implies a desperate, chaotic retreat.
But the text emphasizes that hijra is absolutely not escapism. It is a highly calculated strategic reallocation of resources. You are moving your operations from a hostile, zero-sum environment to a high-yield geographic zone.
Where do they pivot to, does the text say?
It does. The text specifically states they move to Allard, Alati, Baraknafija, which translates roughly to the land which we have blessed. Now, in a geopolitical and historical context, the sources identify this as referring to the highly fertile, resource-rich, strategically positioned regions of Palestine and Syria.
Okay, let's unpack why that specific geography matters. They aren't just wandering aimlessly hoping to find an oasis. Why that region?
Because of the yield. This region was the nexus of ancient trade routes connecting continents. It had immense agricultural fertility. If you want to build a sustainable civilization, you need food security and economic flow.
Right, you need infrastructure.
Exactly. Abraham was migrating a movement to an ecosystem where their physical and economic infrastructure could actually scale.
It makes perfect sense. You don't fight a losing battle in a toxic environment where all your energy goes into mere survival. You relocate to a zone with high potential yield. But, and this is a crucial question, why did they have to leave in the first place? If they were insulated from the heat, if they had Bardan wa Salama, why not just stay and exist quietly?
Because merely existing quietly is not the goal of a rational movement. And this leads us to one of the most fundamentally misunderstood concepts in the text, the idea of prayer, or salat.
Okay, let's get into this.
To explain why they had to migrate, we need to understand what they were actually trying to build and why empires find it so incredibly threatening.
This is where a fascinating historical parallel comes into play from the source material. To illustrate how empires control populations, the sources look at the colonization of India by the British Empire.
It is a brilliant parallel for understanding systemic control. During the British Raj, the empire basically told the colonized populations that they had complete freedom of religion.
Right.
The colonizers were perfectly fine with the locals performing their daily prayers, fasting, engaging in personal spiritual rituals.
The British were essentially saying, go ahead, prostrate in the corner of your mosque or temple as many times a day as you want. We won't stop you.
Precisely. They granted the illusion of freedom. You can have your personal rituals as long as those rituals do not challenge the economic and political authority of the state.
Wow.
You can pray, but we control the taxation, the resources, and the laws. Actual sovereignty was entirely denied. And this brings us back to the Quranic concept of salat.
Because salat isn't just permission to pray in private.
Far from it. When you look at the linguistic root and the systemic application in the text, salat is the establishment of an independent, sovereign, socioeconomic system.
So it's much bigger than a ritual.
It is a comprehensive framework for society. It is not a private ritual. It is a public, systemic reality that governs how wealth is distributed, how justice is served, and how human rights are protected.
And an empire cannot tolerate an independent socioeconomic system operating within its borders.
Exactly, which is why the text brings up the story of Shu'aib.
Yes. The story of Shu'aib perfectly illustrates this, and honestly, it's hilarious and tragic at the same time. The people in Shu'aib's society weren't complaining because he was bowing down too much in his living room.
No, not at all.
They complained because his salat, his systemic order, was directly interfering with their predatory capitalism.
They explicitly push back against him in the text. It records them asking, "Does your salat command you that we should leave what our fathers worshipped, or that we should stop doing what we please with our wealth?"
They knew exactly what he was doing.
They recognized immediately that his system was an economic threat. It was an anti-exploitation system. It prevented them from hoarding capital and manipulating the markets.
Which means, if your religion is just a private ritual that the corrupt empire completely ignores because it poses no threat to their power well, you aren't actually establishing salat, you're just pacifying yourself.
And this systemic lens completely redefines how we view charity as well, the concept of care and khairat.
Let's talk about khairat, because the traditional view of charity is so deeply ingrained in us. I mean, the traditional model is essentially the wealthy elite tossing leftover scraps of dough to beggars on the street.
Right, the whole bakers can't be choosers mentality.
Exactly. It treats charity as a mechanism to stroke the ego of the rich.
It maintains the power dynamic, it keeps the poor dependent and the rich feeling morally superior. But true care, in the context of building a civilization according to this text, dismantles that ego-driven model entirely.
So?
It is not about making a starving person grateful for your leftovers. It means establishing a systemic welfare state. It means structural empowerment.
So it's the difference between, say, a billionaire donating a fraction of their wealth to a food bank for a PR photo op versus a society that structurally ensures, through fair wages and resource distribution, that no human being ever needs a food bank in the first place.
Yes. One system relies on the arbitrary whim of a local wealthy elite to prevent starvation. The other establishes an independent socio-economic system where human dignity is guaranteed by the state. That is khairat.
Okay, but what happens when a society vehemently rejects the systemic order? Because the text doesn't just show the successes, right? It shows the failures. And this introduces a really profound linguistic analogy that I had never heard before looking at these sources, the concept of the aphasic.
The aphasic analogy is arguably one of the most powerful visual metaphors in the entire textual sequence. To understand what happens to a society that rejects natural and social laws, we really have to look at the agricultural root of the word physique.
I want you to break this down because it's fundamentally about fruit, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Think about the biological mechanics of a healthy fruit, like a date ripening on a tree. It grows, it expands, and it matures within its protective skin. That skin bounds it, protects it from external contamination, and allows it to reach its full nutritional potential.
So the skin represents the protective boundaries of universal laws, the ethical and economic systems we just talked about.
Correct. A healthy society operates within those protective boundaries. But a phasic is a specific agricultural phenomenon. It describes a piece of fruit that begins to rot from the inside out.
Oh, gross, but apt.
Very apt. As that toxic rot expands, it creates internal pressure. Eventually, the rot bursts through the protective skin entirely.
Wow, so it destroys its own boundaries from the inside.
Exactly. A phasic society is one that shatters the protective boundaries of natural and social laws through corruption, exploitation, and mutual destruction. The traditional myth is that an angry god looks down from the sky and arbitrarily smites a city with lightning.
Right, like Sodom and Gomorrah style.
Right. But the systemic reality presented here is that by bursting through their structural boundaries, these societies engineer their own inevitable self-destruction. The internal rot consumes them.
So when a movement migrates to a new zone to establish an independent economic system, they aren't just trying to get rich. They are trying to save humanity from becoming a aphasic society that rots from the inside. They were trying to cultivate a healthy fruit.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the next phase of the historical timeline. Because once you've successfully migrated and you've established this healthy, insulated system, the question becomes, how do you scale it?
Right, how do you defend it? How do you build a superpower?
Exactly. And this brings us to verse 79.
And I have to say, this is where we enter the quote-unquote fairy tale zone, because the Sunday school stories really go off the rails when King David enters the picture.
They really do. The traditional translation of verse 79 reads that the Jabal, the mountains, and the Ter, the birds, were subordinated to sing praises with David.
Okay, I am going to push back here for a second, because decoding this into geopolitics is fascinating, but it takes away a bit of the poetic romance, doesn't it? I mean, the idea of a king sitting on a tranquil mountaintop, playing a beautiful melody on a harp, the literal mountains humming along in perfect resonance, and a flock of sparrows singing in harmony. Doesn't the poetry of those singing mountains get lost when we turn this into a cold military briefing?
It is a beautiful image, I grant you that. It's very poetic. But I would argue that the socio-political reality of the actual text is far more profound and honestly far more poetic than a scene from a children's book.
Okay, sell me on it.
Let's look at the harsh reality of statecraft in the ancient world. You are trying to build a unified, secure nation. But what does the term al-Jibal really represent in the sociolinguistic context of that era?
Well, literally it means mountains. But geopolitically?
Geopolitically, it refers to the mountain tribes, the rugged, fiercely independent, untamed warlords and heavy labor sectors that occupy the high ground. Historically, these are the factions that violently resist central authority.
Oh, that makes sense.
They are the absolute hardest elements to bring into a unified state. You cannot just command a mountain tribe to submit. They will bleed you dry in an insurgency.
So David didn't make literal rocks sing.
No. His geopolitical genius was that he successfully negotiated with, integrated, and unified these rugged, hostile factions into his central state infrastructure. He brought the mountains into harmony with the state. He aligned their economic incentives with the central government. He provided shared defense and infrastructure.
Okay, when you explain the mechanics of it, the diplomatic and political achievement is actually staggering. Getting independent, heavily armed warlords and grueling labor factions to synchronize with a central system without a massive civil war is infinitely harder and honestly more impressive than playing a harp.
Exactly. And this completely reframes the second half of that verse, alter, the birds.
Right, because if the mountains aren't rocks, the birds aren't sparrows doing his bidding. In the context of ancient tribal warfare and state defense, what does the birds actually mean?
It refers to rapid reconnaissance, courier networks, border scouts, intelligence gatherers, and fast cavalry. Think of the linguistic idioms we still use today.
Like getting a bird's eye view.
A bird's eye view. Or horses that are so swift they fly like birds.
So Altair is an ancient intelligence and rapid response network.
Yes. David engineered a highly organized, dual capability state. He had his heavy infantry and integrated labor of the mountains, and his rapid reconnaissance and cavalry of the birds.
But wait, the text explicitly says that these mountains and birds were doing tasbih with him. And the universally accepted traditional view of tasbih is a person sitting in a corner, quietly spinning physical rosary beads, murmuring praises to God. How does heavy infantry and fast cavalry do tasbih?
This requires us to look at the historical origin of the physical rosary beads we call tasbih today. Historical tracing by the source material shows that the use of these prayer beads actually originated with Christian monks in Syria and other regions who used them to count their chants.
Right, so the physical beads were an adopted practice later on.
Yes, adopted much later by Muslim cultures. But the Quranic concept of tasbih, the actual linguistic root of the word, has absolutely nothing to do with sitting passively in a monastery spinning beads.
What does the root mean?
The root meaning of tasbih is to remain constantly in motion. It's akin to a swimmer gliding swiftly and smoothly through the water without thinking or flailing.
So it means fluid, continuous action.
It means being highly active, flawlessly executing one's systemic duties without friction, delay, or internal resistance. It is the concept of a mechanism functioning exactly as it was designed to function.
This completely blows my mind. So David's birds and mountains doing tasbih means that his military and intelligence networks weren't sitting around praying in a circle. It means his heavy infantry and his fast cavalry were perfectly synchronized. They were highly organized, flawlessly executing the defensive and operational mandates of the state.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of statecraft, it is the ultimate description of a well-oiled machine. The entire nation, from the rugged labor forces to the swift intelligence networks, is humming in perfect unison, executing the blueprint of a healthy society. That is true tasbih.
That is so much cooler than a musical circus. It's like finding out the story isn't about a guy who can talk to animals, but about a genius tactician who unified a fractured continent and built a flawless military-industrial complex.
And that genius, that empirical competence, is exactly what the text focuses on next. Because building and maintaining this kind of state requires an engine of reason. It requires leadership that is audited not by claims of divine magic, but by actual measurable competence.
Which brings us to the tyranny of unproven assertions in verses 78 and 79. Because right in the middle of this epic geopolitical treatise, the text drops in a seemingly mundane case study, a judicial evaluation. David and his son Solomon have to judge an agricultural dispute.
It seems like a strange tangent at first glance. Someone's sheep ruined another person's field.
Right, and what's frustrating is how traditional commentaries treat this. They completely miss the point. They waste pages and pages arguing over trivial, entirely irrelevant details.
Like what kind of sheep they were.
Exactly. How many sheep were there? What specific color was the field? Did the sheep eat the grapes, or did they just eat the leaves?
Which is entirely beside the point. The text includes this specific case study to demonstrate a revolutionary method of judicial evaluation and governance.
Walk us through the mechanics of this dispute. What actually happened, and why does it matter?
The basic scenario is that a shepherd's flock escapes at night and grazes in a farmer's field, destroying the crop. Now, the conventional, traditional ruling, which David initially leaned toward, was a simple, punitive transfer of assets.
Okay.
The shepherd's sheep destroyed the farmer's livelihood, so you take the sheep away from the shepherd and give them permanently to the farmer to compensate for the loss.
Which seems fair on the surface, an eye for an eye, economically speaking.
It seems fair, but it creates a new problem. You have now permanently ruined the shepherd's livelihood to fix the farmer's livelihood. It's a zero-sum game. But Solomon, his son, analyzes the data and comes up with a different, more refined systemic solution.
What was Solomon's solution?
Solomon ruled that the farmer should temporarily take possession of the sheep. He could use their yield, the milk, and the wool to financially sustain himself. Meanwhile, the shepherd was ordered to work the farmer's field, using his labor to rehabilitate the land.
Oh, that is brilliant.
Right. Once the field was fully restored to its original fruitful state, the sheep would be returned to the shepherd.
It's focused on rehabilitation rather than just punitive damage. The farmer survives off the flock's yield, the shepherd repairs the damage he caused, and in the end, both men walk away with their livelihoods intact. It's a complete win-win.
Exactly. And the text explicitly states that Solomon was given a deeper functional understanding of the system. The Arabic phrase uses fahamna ha Suleiman, which means we caused Solomon to understand it. But it is crucial to recognize that this is not a magical, supernatural download of information into his brain.
Right, it's a mandate for empirical problem solving.
It's a direct mandate for empirical evaluation over emotional, dogmatic, or even traditional assertions.
So what does this mean for the concept of leadership as presented in the text?
It completely strips political authority of any mystical, unproven claims of divine right.
That is massive, especially in an ancient world where every king claimed the gods put them on the throne and their word was unquestionable law.
It is revolutionary. The text is tying the absolute right to lead directly to intellectual competence. It's about data processing capability. It's about the capacity to engineer win-win solutions for real-world social friction. Solomon wasn't praised because he prayed harder than his father. He was praised because he looked at the hard data of the sheep in the field, understood the economic impact, and engineered a superior socioeconomic outcome for the citizens.
Leadership is audited by competence. I love that phrasing. It means you can't just inherit the throne, sit there with a crown, and claim God wants you to rule. You have to continually prove you have the analytical refinement to run the system. Because if you can't fix the friction in the agricultural sector, you have absolutely no business running the heavy infantry and the fast cavalry.
And speaking of heavy industry, this rational alignment with empirical problem solving leads directly into the mastery of the physical sciences. Which brings us to verse 80 and the application of social physics.
Yes, social physics. This is where the manual really starts showing the schematics. We move into verse 80, and the text explicitly shifts to advanced industrial engineering. The phrase used is sanata labisin lakum, which refers to the manufacturing of armor and protective shielding.
Now, you have to ask yourself, why would a text that traditionalists read as a carefully spiritual, ethereal fairy tale suddenly pause to give a detailed mandate on advanced metallurgy and the manufacturing of chainmail?
Because it's a blueprint for civilizational survival. It's not just about blacksmithing, it's the pure social physics of survival. The text explicitly states that this technology was developed for a moral purpose, to protect human life from its own mutual violence. The Arabic is litusinakum min basikum.
This is the law of requital in action.
I was trying to come up with an analogy for this, and I think it comes down to software and hardware. Having moral superiority without manufacturing capability is like having a brilliantly coded software program, say, an AI that could perfectly distribute global resources and solve world hunger. But you have absolutely no hardware to run it on. You have no servers, no computers, no fiber optics. That beautiful software is utterly useless in the physical world.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
You cannot run advanced moral software without heavy industrial hardware.
And yet, the traditional myths totally miss this crucial point. Do you know what some of the traditional folklore claims about this verse? They claim that King David was a destitute beggar who magically softened iron with his bare hands just to make a single shirt of chainmail so he could sell it in the market and buy a loaf of bread for his family.
It's insulting to the text. It completely diminishes the scale of what is happening. David was a sovereign. He was the head of a geopolitical superpower. He wasn't sitting in a dusty alleyway magically molding iron like clay to buy his daily bread. He was engineering a massive state-sponsored defense infrastructure. The law of requital dictates that you must match your moral blueprint with physical manufacturing.
Because if you don't,
If you have the right values, if you have established a beautiful system of salat and care, but your enemy has better metallurgy, superior armor, and heavier industry, your values will be erased from the face of the earth. History does not care how righteous you are if you cannot defend your borders.
you have to protect the system with actual physical shielding. And this mastery of the physical world doesn't stop at defense. It scales up even further with Solomon in verse 81.
Verse 81 is where Solomon is said to have harnessed the high-velocity wind currents. The text uses the phrase, al-riya asifatan.
Right, here we go with the superhero wind powers. The popular myth is that Solomon had a magic carpet, or that he could bend the wind to his will like a wizard commanding a storm.
But when we demystify this through the lens of civilizational physics, what is actually happening? Solomon wasn't a wizard. He was mastering naval navigation. He was utilizing advanced meteorological knowledge of seasonal high-velocity wind currents to drive massive maritime trade fleets across the oceans.
And where were those trade fleets going? They were driving resources toward the highly fertile strategic geography we mentioned earlier, Allard, Alati, Baraknafija. He was building a global logistics network.
Exactly. True worship, true ibadah in this textual framework is not merely sitting in a temple spinning prayer beads. It is mastering natural resources through rigorous scientific knowledge. The text explicitly states, Kuna bikuli shay'in alamin, which means we are the knowers of all things. It is the practical application of scientific knowledge to create an unshakable, sustainable, and globally connected economy. Solomon mastered the winds by understanding meteorology, aerodynamics, and shipbuilding, using those physical laws to power a maritime empire that secured his nation's prosperity.
Okay, I want to step back and synthesize this incredible journey we've just been on. Because the transformation of this text from a simple bedtime story to a complex civilizational blueprint is just staggering. We started with a movement caught in the furnace of state persecution.
And we realized that surviving that fire isn't about hoping for a suspension of the laws of physics. It's about systemic insulation. Salama building the psychological fortitude and alternative networks required to keep your movement functioning under immense pressure.
Then we moved through the strategic migration, the hijra. We learned it wasn't about running away in fear, but a calculated pivot to high-yield, resource-rich zones. And why did they move? To establish an independent socio-economic system, a true salat that challenged the corrupt monopolies of the time.
We saw how that sovereign system must be protected from rotting from the inside out like a aphasic fruit. And we saw how a true state scales its power by integrating the rugged mountain tribes and deploying rapid intelligence networks, uncovering the real geopolitical meaning of the mountains and the birds operating in flawless Tasbih.
We analyzed how leadership in this advanced system is audited purely by empirical competence and the ability to solve complex social friction, perfectly illustrated by Solomon's brilliant rehabilitation plan for the agricultural dispute. And finally, we arrived at the absolute necessity of heavy industry, metallurgy, and global maritime logistics, building the physical hardware to run and protect the moral software.
It lays out a rational, unyielding alignment with natural and social laws. The source material argues that this is the only way to build a resilient, enduring superpower.
So I want to turn this over to you, the listener. Think about your own environment. Think about the challenges, the political or economic heat you face in your career, your community, or your organizational structures. When the pressure is on, are you sitting around waiting for a miracle? Are you trying to cast magic spells to stop the fire around you? Or are you doing the hard empirical work? Are you building the systemic insulation, the redundant networks, and the heavy infrastructure needed to actually thrive in the real physical world?
That is the ultimate question this text demands we answer. It is a complete, uncompromising blueprint for global influence and societal resilience.
It really is. It changes how you view everything from ancient history to modern statecraft. But as we wrap up, there is a lingering question here, a massive variable we haven't accounted for. We've talked all about the macro, the heavy industry, the global logistics, the unified mountain tribes, the statecraft. But what happens when the human elements running this massive, perfectly tuned infrastructure face absolute personal crises?
It is the ultimate vulnerability. What happens when the visionary individuals at the helm of this superpower are suddenly struck by debilitating physical illnesses that threaten to bring the whole system crashing down?
That is exactly what we are going to explore in our next deep dive into this textual sequence. We're going to look at the sequence principle of human frailty. But until then, remember, don't confuse a highly advanced engineering manual for a magic glowing rock. Stop waiting for miracles and start building your infrastructure.